Senator Josh Hawley is back in the news, this time for a speech he gave at the National Conservatism Conference on what he calls, quote, the left's attack on America and American men. Let's listen to some of that.
But what I want you to notice, what I want to call out tonight, is that the deconstruction of America begins with and depends on the deconstruction of American men. The left want to define traditional masculinity as toxic. They want to define the traditional masculine virtues, things like courage and independence and assertiveness, as a danger to society. This is an effort that the left has been at for years now, and they have had alarming success. American men are working less. They're getting married in fewer numbers. They're fathering fewer children. They're suffering more anxiety and depression. They're engaging in more substance abuse. Many men in this country are in crisis, and their ranks are swelling. Can we be surprised that after years of being told that they are the problem, that their manhood is the problem, more and more men are withdrawing into the enclave of idleness and pornography and video games? I found the comment by one young man to a Wall Street Journal reporter particularly evocative and particularly heartbreaking. He said, "I'm sort of waiting for a light to come on so I can figure out what to do next." I suspect that he speaks for many.
Hawley went on to advocate for legislation that would incentivize both domestic manufacturing and family building. Joining us now to give their take is Team Rising. Max Alvarez is editor-in-chief at The Real News and host of the Working People podcast. And Patrice Onwuka is a senior policy analyst at the Independent Women's Forum. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ben.
So, Patrice, I think, look, obviously Josh Hawley makes a point about some of the ways the social justice left talks about gender and talks about men is very alienating and unhealthy. Where I get totally lost on this is the idea that the government needs to do something about it, or that video games are the problem. This sort of is reminiscent of past moral panics about video games and comic books and other things that were, as prevalent on the Democratic side as they were on the Republican side. What's your take?
So I will agree with you that, I don't necessarily think the government incentivizing good behavior has to be the only solution or the first solution. What I will say, though, that Hawley puts his finger on is something that we've seen a trend. Christina Hoff Sommers, she does a phenomenal job explaining kind of this war on boys and how this has started in our educational systems where, boys have been considered number one, the teacher's pet, and also probably aggressive, violent, and wanting, interested in sexually harassing little girls. It's created resentment for boys. At the same time, a really good goal of advancing girls forward in their educations has meant that you've had to implement policies that pull boys behind. And so it's starting at our K through 12 level, where you're trying to redress an issue with women's advancement in education by frankly doing something that harms men. And then you see it show up when we look at the college enrollment numbers, where 60% of college students are female and 40% are men. So there's something going on with the young men, the boys in our society. Now, is that the role of the government to use tax incentives to encourage them to get married? I want them to get married because they find a partner that they can build a life with. That's great. Where I think the government should be focused is on work, and what are we doing, both disincentivizing as well as incentivizing people, particularly men, to be productive in finding work, whether that is through manufacturing or skills and labor, or through traditional or white collar jobs. But I'm very hesitant to say that it is the government's job to solve this problem, although I do give that the government contributed to some of this.
So, Max, what's your take on this? And for me, I do, Hawley is not a messenger for this that I think has any credibility at all. I was going to make fun of him for using the word deconstructed and masculinity right next to each other, but then I remembered my podcast is called Deconstructed. But in my defense, I didn't name it. I took it over from somebody else.
You love it.
And But he's not wrong that there is a crisis going on. And if I just think anecdotally about my own life, I'm in my early 40s, and a tremendous number of the boys, now men, that I grew up with aren't even alive anymore. Every year another couple of our friends from middle school, high school, we find are dying of things they should not be dying of, and that's just one manifestation of this crisis. And so, what does Hawley get right here, and what do you think he's missing?
So it's a really interesting text to examine, right? And I would start by kind of echoing Robbie's point, right? That what first struck me when I watched this whole thing is that, as I've mentioned many times on the show before, I grew up very conservative, very Catholic. I've been hearing this argument or versions of this argument my entire life, right? I mean, I have heard it in popular culture. I've heard it on right-wing media. I've heard it in my church. I've heard it in my community. Anytime in the 90s that feminists said anything, basically, anytime that gay couples wanted and demanded the right to be able to marry, we heard the same thing about the mass emasculation of American men, so on and so forth. When metrosexual was a thing in the early 2000s, there was this huge moral panic about like a crisis in masculinity. This has been happening, like in every decade for, basically as long as America has existed, in my opinion. What is interesting, though, and what I think Hawley, I agree. I don't think he's going to be too successful, but I think you see a representative of the collective conservative mind work out an essential problem in real time, and actually kind of finding some inroads that I think that we need to be paying attention to, right? Because what Hawley's speech is kind of an expert example in speaking to an aggrieved working class, speaking to the pain and isolation and meaninglessness and hopelessness that a lot of working class people feel, but then expertly pirouetting and dancing around any root causes of that problem, and instead kind of doing the kind of traditional thing of telling people to punch sideways instead of to punch up, right? This is in some way a version of what Trump did with immigrants in 2016, right? It's telling working people that the person who is responsible for your pain is to your left or to your right, not the person above you who controls way more of your life than anyone around you. That, I think, is what is really essential here, because I know there will be a lot of people. I have a lot of friends, too, to whom Hawley's speech will actually resonate. And I want to speak to them right now and explain to you how Hawley is actually ripping you off, right? Let's ignore the kind of larger sort of culture war, the battles about how we define gender and so on and so forth. Let's take Hawley's terms at face value, and let's say that you are someone who does prize those quote unquote traditional masculine values. The ones he said were independence, assertiveness, things like your ability to provide for yourself and your family. The left is not your enemy in that regard. The left is not the one who has the power to take that away from you. Your boss has the power to take that away from you. Mm-hmm. Corporations that exploit you, that are seeing major profits right now and still raising the prices on consumers to squeeze more out of people, to break unionization efforts that would give workers more ability to have that independence and assertiveness in the workplace. Those are the people who are stripping your quote unquote masculinity away from you. Think about the 1968 Memphis sanitation strike. Those black workers had signs that said, I am a man. They said that the exploitation that I face on the job, the callousness with which my humanity is disregarded, that is what rips out my ability to be a man in this society. It's not, the people next to me. It's the people who control my very livelihood. That is what you should be focusing on.
Yeah.
Can we add the government then to that list of people who are above you, who are implementing regulations that make it difficult for you to get into the jobs, the occupations, the skills, the careers, even starting businesses that you may be more than qualified for? Max, we've been on this panel before. I pushed back when you talked about unionization as being the kind of the thing that's going to free the individual today in this workplace and in this work environment. There's a role for unions, sure, but I also do think, and maybe it's to Hawley's point, that government plays a huge role. And I do see that greater government involvement is not going to be the solution to that, nor is unionization going to be the solution to that. There's a reason why 27 states are right to work states, and they need to be.
All right. Max and Patrice, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And we'll be back with more Rising in just a moment.